I am now proud to introduce Nil Zacharias, who is an entrepreneur, advisor, author, and podcaster who has spent the past 10 years focused on the intersection of food and sustainability. He hosts the Eat for the Planet podcast and co-authored the Eat for the Planet books. He heads food systems innovation at FFAC Partners and is co-founder of Plantega, Spire, 80/20 Plants, and previously founded and ran the media platform One Green Planet. Prior to focusing on food systems change, Nil worked in the media and technology space for a decade and started his career as a lawyer in Bombay, India. Nil, thank you for joining us from the East Coast, where it's already 8 p.m. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be on.
Wonderful. All right. So as I was reading your bio and reviewing your LinkedIn, I'm just always struck by how many things you do and how many things you seem to do simultaneously. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you transitioned from being a lawyer in India to eventually working in media technology, and how you are founding all of these new initiatives and seemingly able to divide your time so well.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief, but when I was in law school, I was, so this, something that you won't find on my LinkedIn is that I played in a band, and I was really into music more than I was into food necessarily. My goal was really to get out of law school and become an entertainment lawyer. I really just wanted to focus on the music industry because I knew I wasn't going to cut it as a musician. Professionally at least. So that really didn't go exactly according to plan. The music industry around the same time was starting to kind of fall apart because of the rise of the internet and music streaming and everything that was happening. And I quickly started focusing majority of my first 2 years where I practiced law, doing technology and transactional work. And very quickly realized that that being in a law firm was not something I wanted to do. So I spent
okay, well, I get it. Okay, so then I have one.
So I spent the next decade of my first decade of my career pretty much in the media and technology industries. I was, climbing the corporate ladder. I worked at different startups, and one of them got acquired by Yahoo, which is a dinosaur of the internet age. I worked there for a while, and then it was about now 11 years ago on a vacation where I was in South America of all places, and I say all places because I actually spent majority of that vacation really enjoying what I would then call the amazing grass-fed beef that I was being served in Argentina and Brazil. And it led me to start asking questions about food and food sustainability, actually food initially, which got me answers that I didn't necessarily want. That was the first time I learned about the fact that rainforests in Brazil were being cut down to make room to grow soy and for cattle grazing. And my question was, who's eating the soy? And then I found out the soy was then being fed to chickens and pigs in the US and elsewhere around the world. So it kind of planted a seed. Firstly, I ate too much beef on that vacation, and then it planted a seed about how the food I was eating made its way to my table. And the more I learned about it, the more I thought about it, the less I really wanted to eat most of it. So that's kind of what began my journey for the past decade, I would say. It really led me to want to do something to solve that problem the more I learned about the impact, especially of factory farming, on the environment. And I felt it was the biggest problem of our lifetime, and no one was really talking about it. We are luckily doing a lot more talking now, but I think we need more than talking. So I'll stop there for the moment and see if you have any follow-ups.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for starting off by sharing that you were in a band. I saw Rowdy nodding very enthusiastically there. You can talk to him about that at some other point. It's interesting that you're bringing up South America, because we had a CultureShift conversation with Matthew Hayek, and he was also very similarly inspired and was very concerned about rainforests being turned into essentially, places for all the animals, or for us to grow more crops to feed animals. We did have a question, I think, that's related to this. In our signups for this event, people could submit questions in advance, and people are asking why there's so much resistance to hearing the facts about dietary cause emissions. And I was listening to one of your interviews with Chris Hedges, And I thought it was really interesting how we were framing environmental arguments with him. And it started off with, by 2050, there will be 9.8 billion people. And that, of course, is very concerning how we're going to have all that huge number of people. But then you also talked about how climate change is sometimes a really abstract issue, and we should be focusing on water and clean air. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what the resistance is, what arguments or framing you found really compelling, especially as the host for the Eat for the Planet podcast.
Yeah, I would say, when you say climate change, I learned this early on. When I would talk about climate change, most people's eyes would glaze over and they would lose interest and get instantly bored. Because when they heard climate change, they thought about greenhouse gas emissions, and they felt like this is all about something that you can't truly get a sense of, and it was going to happen in the future. And so not that I don't talk about greenhouse gas emissions, but I quickly realized that, especially when it came to food, the climate change was just one aspect of what was happening. And it was, everything is interconnected at the end of the day. You can't really separate one cause from the resulting action. So the thing about, food sustainability and the impact of factory farming specifically, and I try to articulate that even in the book that we published a few years ago, was that there are multiple impacts to the way we farm animals today. And it's partly you kind of have to take a bit of a step back to even before you go to 2050 and see where our population is going. You've got to try to understand how we got to this point. We got to this point, if you go really way back in 1870, in the late 1870s, it was really initially the push was to get animals out of urban areas. And that need to keep city streets clean, because back in 1870, you didn't have factory farms, you had slaughterhouses basically in urban areas. So you would have animals being transported within the city. You would have, blood, guts, and poop all over the place. And the initial push to have farms move out west was out of the concern, ironically, the concern for clean air and clean water, which began the movement that we were going to need to put our farms out of sight of these urban areas where sophisticated people lived. And that began, in the late 1800s. And then you had multiple waves of events that happened. And I guess technology always tends to play a role. You had the birth of transportation technology. So you had to have a railway system if you needed to import animals from somewhere else. You needed refrigeration technology. And then, to really fast forward, we experienced World War I, which was the first time the US actually had to increase production of food to feed to not only feed the soldiers in Europe that were fighting the war, but also because we had labor shortages in the US. And that again happened in World War II. So these, events from 1870 to 1914 to 20 to then again in 1940 led to this process where and I think the wars are important because they played a role in accelerating the growth of technology. And around the same time, something interesting was happening globally, which is, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. You've probably heard me say this before, and human beings have been on this planet for 200,000 years. Things were pretty fine for the first 200,000 years of our existence on this planet, but changed drastically in the last 200 years. And if you really had to pinpoint what happened, it was one, we took 200,000 years to get to a population of 1 billion, and only 200 years to get to 7 billion. And also in those same 200 years, we had this boom in industrialization. So every industry was impacted, and of course, so was farming. So we went from these hand-driven methods of extracting natural resources to machine-driven methods. And so back to your original question, when you are now extracting resources from the planet at a pace, at a scale much faster than those resources are capable of replenishing themselves, you end up where we are today, where factory farming uses up majority of our arable land, uses up a majority of our fresh water. It is destroying the rainforest, as we've discussed earlier, and it is contributing to air pollution and water pollution. And of course, all of these actions then have downstream impacts. So when we are For example, cutting down a rainforest, you don't just lose the trees, you lose the natural habitat. It then impacts biodiversity, which leads to species extinction. So there's these cascading effects. And on top of that, we're releasing more carbon into the atmosphere, while factory farms themselves are huge carbon emitters, plus the food used is responsible for a majority of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so you have this, perfect storm of problems all encapsulated in the food system. And what is interesting about food is it often gets ignored. When people talk about climate change, it's easy to point to the fossil fuel industry, and rightfully so. You should point to fossil fuels, and you should point to cars. And the last thing people have usually wanted to talk about is what's on your plate, because, and I'll have to be honest about it, is partly because people feel like they don't have control. And that is partly true, which is the food system is controlled by a few big companies. Most people don't realize that 99% of the meat, dairy, and eggs you get in the US especially is produced in factory farms. You have this illusion of control when you walk into a grocery store and you see aisles and aisles of products. You don't realize the organic brands, the processed brands, the meat is all pretty much controlled by the same few companies. Who are now, have different brand names and are marketing the products in different ways depending on whatever the new trends are. But as a consumer, you kind of feel disempowered and you kind of feel like there's nothing you can do. And so when someone talks to you about climate change, and then you say, well, you can fix it by changing your diet, or you can fix it by focusing on food, it feels like too much of a leap to most people, and they'd rather just focus on like divesting from coal and something else. So it's felt like, that's a simplistic answer, even though I did give you a bit of history to get to that answer, because food is way more complicated than anything else. It's not like replacing a light bulb. Food is part of our culture, it's part of our history, it's part of daily life. And so some people also feel like when you attack their food, you're attacking your culture or you're attacking your traditions. When all we're trying to say is it's not the food that's the problem, it's the unintended consequences of developing an industrialized system to produce food that is reliant on using living beings that were never intended to be used in the way they are used today. And so it is, I say unintended because I don't think someone sat back in 1920 and said, we're going to devise this thing called factory farming where we're going to torture animals and pollute the planet. It kind of, and this is a warning for the future, is that when you make decisions, you've got to start thinking about their consequences, because what we've ended up now is this place where we have to find a way out of this system. I hope I answered your question, but I was really trying to illustrate the challenge and the complexity involved in even, identifying the problem here.
Yeah, it is very complex. And, we are the Factory Farming Awareness Coalition. So everything that you outlined, we're struggling all the time to figure out, what do we convey? How do we convey it? Because it's all for, I think, your books, your podcasts, and some of it is very much based in like, we just need to raise awareness of this. And I'm wondering how you made the decisions to start writing these books, or to found One Green Planet, or co-found it, and then to move to the podcast. Like, how did you decide to raise awareness through all these different mediums?
Yeah, I think when I first realized that this is the issue I wanted to focus the rest of my life on, back in 2010 or 2011, a year after I first woke up to this whole idea, much later in life, actually. I thought I was an educated, informed human being, and I didn't even know how, milk was truly produced, or, that the fact that farm animals ate soy. I didn't know those facts somehow. Obviously I wasn't paying attention. And so my first instinct was, I understand media. I've worked in media companies. I understand the power of using online advertising and storytelling. Why don't I apply that skill set to this topic? And that's what gave birth to One Green Planet in my first effort in this space. And the idea was simple. It's like, communicate the facts, bring in multiple voices, share the facts in a way that is compelling to a younger audience and do it in a way that feels like it is not just about informing you, but also about inspiring you to take action. So that was, I remember coming up with our editorial strategy and saying, if you're informing and not empowering someone to do something, we're not doing justice to the work we're supposed to be doing. So informing was important, but you had to empower them and then inspire them to take some sort of action. So most of the initial content, and that, if you look at it now, it's probably changed, but this is when I was running it. The goal was every piece of content has to share the facts, source it really, do a rigorous research when we share facts. And in the end, don't leave the reader feeling a sense of despair. Give them some sort of a positive action that they can take. It could be something as simple as signing a petition, or it could be sharing something on social media. Keep in mind, when we launched, it was 2012, 2013, early days of Facebook and Instagram. And we've really leveraged those tools, grew our audience. And we found there was a real receptivity to this idea of communicating really tough facts in a way that felt friendly, but also then pointing people to what action you could take. And sometimes the action was, look, we've got recipes. Why don't you go try and eat this food? Or we've got some cute farm animals that were rescued from a horrific factory farm. Why don't you go watch those videos? And we would also partner with the sanctuaries and the nonprofits in the space. And we said, hey, let's be this neutral platform that brings all of you together, because you all have your own agendas and your focus. And let's just all get together and tackle this problem holistically. It was a great experiment. It worked to a certain extent, and it didn't work to a certain extent. And the reason it didn't work is because I find after a while, telling people what to do only goes so far. And especially online, because I feel like as the years went by, and we know this too well now, attention span started to decline, where we had to oversimplify a lot of our content, put it into little lists, make it very catchy, put little videos where no one was actually getting much out of it. It started to become more like we were just reaching the echo chamber that agreed with us, which was never my intention. My idea was to reach new people. And so that initially led me to think, okay, I gotta do more. And so that eventually led to the book, because I felt like we needed a book or something physical that could just be handed out to someone in a classroom or in a university and just say, hey, just look at this tiny little book. It's full of infographics. So if you don't like reading, don't worry. So I pitched the book to the publisher by saying this was going to be the book for the social media generation, where you don't even have to read the whole book to get the gist of what the subject matter is. And especially because the subject matter was very fact heavy, very science heavy, and most science or most environmental books I had read until that point, frankly, bored me to death as well. The whole idea was, how can we condense this into something that is shareable? And that was the book. And then we followed up with a cookbook. And I'll just close this out with the podcast, because it really follows that thread. And it kind of touches on this idea of me realizing that even when you do media, one specific thing maybe addresses a specific kind of person. And that's why you've got to experiment with different mediums and different types of storytelling. If I looked at my media platform in the beginning, it was a lot of, here are the facts, here are the bad things about factory farming, here's what you should do. It was pretty cut and dry. There was no nuance to it. The book was very much fact-based again. And the cookbook was maybe more actionable, because you could actually make recipes, and the recipes featured a lot of the plant-based brands that you probably heard of now. But then I launched the podcast because I felt like there was something shifting, especially in the food industry, where we were now seeing a whole new crop of entrepreneurs come about who may have been activists in the past, or some of them were former activists, and some of them maybe just were activists at heart, but wanted to find a way to change the system from the inside out. When I say the system, I mean the food system, this big, bad, terrible factory farming system that we had. And so I felt, the podcast could then be a forum for me to share their journeys, their stories, what are they working on. And I got many of them in the early days. It was, Ethan Brown from Beyond Meat was on pretty early on the podcast. If you look back at the early episodes, it features nearly every founder of every vegan company you've probably heard of, plus heads of nonprofits and elsewhere. And I found that to be, a great forum for me to have an in-depth conversation that maybe was the opposite of what I was starting to do with the media platform, where we were dumbing down things. But instead on the podcast, because it's conversational, much like today, you can kind of go deep, and you can follow someone's journey from their beginning to how they took an idea and then brought it out into the world. And frankly, that then inspired the rest of the work I've done, which is we can talk about problems all day long. There's no shortage of problems. You can look around and you will find something wrong with everything. But I found it to be really, and this is, again, personally speaking, I think everyone has to choose what works for them. For me, I realized that I much preferred when I operated in a mindset that focused on solutions and focused on building something that would actually help someone. And I think you'll hear a lot of that on the podcast, although sometimes I try to mix it up and challenge some of the people who come on as well, because I do think we need to always question our assumptions and not assume we know everything. And I still am learning a lot, frankly, and I read books on farming and the food system even now, because I feel like as much as I learned, there's so much always left to, because I think another mistake we have made in the past is we attack factory farming, but then we don't really understand what it takes to farm food in general. And we need to make sure we have a well-rounded approach. So.
Yeah, I was just listening to your last episode where you were interviewing Bruce Friedrich, and you did go deep. It was a 2-hour-long podcast, so there was definitely no dumbing down during that episode. One thing that you also mentioned is that it's been a decade of doing this work, and I have really appreciated how you mentioned that you're informing and then empowering, which really does resonate with us, because I have seen so many folks who really care about this issue just like list off all the terrible things that are happening. And I hope that in our work, we're not coming across that way, because empowering is actually very much a part of our mission. And we want to make sure that there are actions for people to be taking, which is why I want to bring the conversation now to Plantega, which I'm really excited about with the bodegas in New York City, because I think that this is one of the most actionable things that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I will try to keep it brief at Plantega, because it's my new obsession, obviously, and that's usually the case with any new project I embark on. But we launched this officially only about 3 months ago, but we did a bit of a pilot in New York City last year. And the idea was fairly simple. Last year, given what happened with COVID and then following the social unrest in this country and all these, everyone seems to be fighting everyone on every issue these days. I really felt like we needed to start to shift the conversation around food, even in the plant-based or the vegan space, to be not just about sustainability and not using animals, but also more about equity and how do we make it accessible and available to everyone. And I noticed one of the things that kind of got me a bit disheartened over the last few years was to see that the plant-based, as much as the vegan and the plant-based food space has grown rapidly in the last 5 to 7 years, it has fallen into the same trap that most other sustainable food movements have fallen into in the past. And 2 great examples are the organic food movement and then, local food or farmers markets. Not to say that organic food is not good or local food and farmers markets are not good. They, of course, are amazing, and we need more of them. The problem is that because most of these new movements have emerged as an alternative to what exists in our conventional industrialized food system, they kind of tend to, although they're trying to be an alternative, they tend to repeat the same flaws sometimes. They replace some flaws, but they retain certain flaws. And the main flaw we noticed is that it tends to, again, be marketed towards people who can anyway afford those and to choose food. So what I'm trying to say is basically the sustainable food movement, for the most part, has been about choice. That we have offering you sustainable foods. You now can choose this versus the unsustainable one. But we forgot in that whole conversation that choice in itself is a privilege that not everyone shares in this country, especially, but obviously across the world as well. Um, and so that led us to think about, all right, so the plant-based food movement, again, you can only find these products at fancy vegan restaurants, or you can find it at Whole Foods and other organic and natural markets. Most of them cost a lot more, and some of it is just inherently how the food system works. But it is also just marketed to the same old, healthy eating, sustainable food crowd. How can we find a way to jumpstart that movement and make it accessible to everyone? How can we shift that story from like, this is an exclusive new product to an inclusive new product, that we add more people to the table instead of making it again for only a small subsegment of the population? How can we basically make this the default choice for more people? And so that eventually led, long story short, but it came to this idea that what if we partnered with some of the best plant-based brands and found a way to bring their products in a unique way to places and in stores in a more distributed, democratic way to parts of a region, especially in areas that lack access to healthy foods or sustainable foods. And most of those areas would have not even heard of vegan food to begin with. And so that was Plantega, was the project that was born out of that, where we're essentially bringing plant-based foods into corner stores or bodegas in New York City. And we install an all-vegan grill in the existing bodega. So they continue to sell what they're selling. We just add a entire vegan menu onto their grill. So you can walk into those locations and buy what you would typically buy. That's the mystery factory farm meat, but instead get it all plant-based. It's also priced very competitively. We also sell retail products. And we do it in a way that is very centered around this idea of empowering. So we are powered by the community. So we hire from within the neighborhoods we operate out of, and we exist only through bodegas at the moment. So instead of us going and creating our own restaurant, we decided, why don't we find a way to get these products to small independently owned stores, all of which were struggling at the time of COVID, and allowed them to tap into this growing plant-based food movement. And by doing so, also bring sustainable, healthy, plant-based foods to consumers who probably have never tried it before and or have been priced out of it, right? So that's been the focus with Plantega. We're in 12 locations now in New York City, but growing fast. So that number is definitely going to change even in a week's time. So, and that's just the beginning. We've been, as I said, officially only 3 months old in this iteration. And our goal is to kind of change this, not just talk about plant-based food, but also change the way it is distributed. Why wait for 10 years, or why wait for McDonald's or Burger King to carry a plant-based burger? Why don't we find ways to get everyone to have this on the menu, so at least someone has that choice? And they may not be making that choice every day, but at least the choice exists. And so, it's all about making access to healthy plant-based food available every day for everyone. And New York City is just the starting point. So hopefully we can go beyond.
Yeah.